Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion this semester for TEL 712. This is Module 2. I'm Kelly here with Melissa, Sandra, and Kamara, and we are going to be discussing our readings this week on survey research. So our instructions were to choose two critical concepts from the Sapsford, Rhea, and Parker readings to describe them and then discuss the implications of the concepts for conducting research on our own problem of practice. So we kind of started off our discussion a little bit before we started recording our responses, but I was talking about surveys are really important for me in the work that I do. I do a lot of instructional design work, and so it's embedded in the last piece of instructional design, the evaluation piece. So I do create a lot of surveys. The two concepts that really stood out for me, which was in the initial reading, was the idea of standardization and the idea of comparison. And these sort of make up the technology of research that Sapsford was talking about that's a part of validity. So for standardization, I just describe that as, they described it actually as consistent answers to consistent questions and the act of applying criteria consistently and reliably. So when I'm creating things, I do make a lot of templates. I'll gather a lot of evidence and questions first to make sure that something is that I'm asking and going to get the answers to what I'm asking, and then have a template and be able to keep kind of duplicating that. So implications for that standardization with my problem of practice, I'm a big fan of it. Like I said, I lean on templates in instructional design for creating courses, as well as creating needs analysis and needs assessment surveys in the beginning, and then review surveys at the end. So I see that same type of strategy to use with my problem of practice. And TPAC, if you guys have followed any of the things that I've talked about before, TPAC is the theoretical framework for my problem of practice. And they have a tool, a survey tool that's already designed for TPAC that measures technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge, which refers to the technology integration of an instructional design program, which is what I'm looking at. That survey is about 50 questions. So I was talking with my workplace, which is a research workplace, and discussing the idea of research fatigue. So I definitely don't want to be giving educators 50 questions. I'm going to pare that down so that it makes sense and is a bit smaller, and given the sample size that I have. But yeah, and then the second concept where I handed off about comparison, they listed this in the reading as a third technology of research that makes up the part of validity. And comparison is, taking two sets of data and trying to come up with a causation, or come up with, a reason why this group is different from this group, or this group is the same as this group. My questions that I have around that, specifically with like my problem of practice, I often view my problem of practice, wanting to design effective professional development that would, and how does it affect technology integration? But my hypothesis is that effective professional development leads to better technology integration. So like knowing that I go in with that bias, how do I make sure that I'm creating surveys that don't have that implicit bias like built in? This was something I had experienced before in thesis work, where they said, just gather the data. Don't like try to go into it with your preconceived notion of what the data is going to be, but like that's there already. So anyway, and then the last thing that I'll say is that I've mentioned I don't work for ASU anymore. I work for a new organization that actually specializes in educational research. And so and their research is around policies and creating change for more equitable education systems. So the past week, in me like digging into IRB and like what I can use and what permissions I need, there may be existing or concurrent research going on at my workplace that I will actually be able to lean into. And this was something that was discussed in the readings as well, like how you would use, I think they call it secondary sources is how they referred to it in the readings. But yeah, didn't mean to talk for so long, but I do love surveys. So I had a lot to say about it, but happy to open it up to anyone else who wants to share their thoughts on what they got out of the readings.
I don't mind jumping in. Hi, everybody. Sorry, still sick here. So I made a connection with what you were sharing, Kelly, about the comparison. From Sapsford, I kind of looked at sort of just the fundamental questions. I found that like helpful to like to be a framework to keep myself organized. So not just one concept, but kind of like all those questions. And then from Rhea and Parker, I've focused on the in-person interviews because I'm not going to be using surveys, I don't think. But I will be doing semi-structured interviews, not in this cycle 1. I don't think I have enough time, but I will do it in cycle 2. So one of the interesting things was Dr. Bowers had suggested I collect artifacts, specifically like maybe pictures from the students about their experience. I'm planning on doing a reflective journal, and in my cycle 2, I'll do the reflective journal, the interviews, and either gather the artifacts and or video the lessons so that I can then look at those recordings and observe the social interactions of the students, and I'll triangulate all that data, which will be good. But yeah, the same idea with like the comparison of the different surveys or whatever data you're getting, right? Just to strengthen those connections, the insights you're developing. So yeah, that was pretty much it from Rhea and Parker. You know, I think that the flexibility that they mentioned, the greater complexity and depth that you can get from an interview, and it also fits my POP better because surveys, you know, they're kindergarten students, they can't read fluently anyway, and I don't know how realistic that would be. So that's sort of where I am. I'll pass the torch on if anybody wants to jump in.
If I can jump in, just because Melissa, you mentioned in-person interviews, and I appreciated all of the readings on surveys. I've had a lot of experience constructing surveys, and I've always said like designing a survey and constructing questionnaires is like so much more science than people think. They just want to slap some questions together. And I've had opportunities to work with researchers in designing. So one of the things I really appreciated from Rhea and Parker's 11 stages of the survey research process, like that, I really liked that section because stage 3, they talk about establishing an information base. To me, it's pretty key to everything. What do you want to know? What are the right questions? So just sitting down before you take pen to paper, that I've seen way too many people just say like, let's just ask them this. I'm like, well, wait, what do you want to know? And so many times what we're asking isn't what we're going to get. So I really appreciated that part. And then stage 6, which is the actual designing of the survey instrument. And, you know, the thinking about how you ask the question will actually inform the answer. And the piloting, it just reminded me of back in the day, like many, many years ago, like 15 years ago, when I was doing some work for Big Brothers Big Sisters, we had to pilot these surveys to see how did it land? Did the students understand the language we were using? And so I don't plan on using, I don't think I'm planning on using any surveys, certainly not for cycle 1, but I do want to do focus groups. And so the design of a semi-structured protocol for a focus group kind of follows the same pattern as you would, you know, here. Like, what do you want to know? How do you think you're going to get to it? What kind of answer do you want? So when you mentioned that you were going to be using interviews, I guess I wasn't cognizant of like the differentiation between quantitative in-person interviews and qualitative in-person interviews. Because then I thought, am I doing that? But I'm not. I'm doing focus groups for cycle 1, and I'm constructing in-person. I think they're going to be in-person, but I think they also might need to be Zoom, which is kind of in-person, but hybrid in-person. And I will need to go through, I want to adhere to a lot of what we saw in Ray Parker's 11 stages here. And then with I can't say their names, Sapsford, the overall design of the survey project, sort of like those 4 stages, I thought really helped outline and just think a lot more about the designing and the testing to make sure you're measuring what you think you're measuring, or you're capturing what you think you need to capture before we actually do that. And I don't know what I'm going to survey on, because it's such an exploratory conversation in my pop that I'm really looking just to see like what surfaces. And then from there, I might then, I think I'm going to do a cycle 2, but what might happen is in cycle 2 is when I might construct a survey based on what I get out of these focus groups, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. That's where I am today on the topic of my pop.
Thanks, Sandra. I can really appreciate what you're saying about constructing something that actually gets at what you want to know. So I am actually going to be testing the Flourishing Leadership curriculum that I would plan to use in a future cycle. So I am using a survey that's already been designed by the researcher and a curriculum that's already been designed by folks from the Oxford Character Project and the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. And so, for me, I was really drawn to, I obviously want to so it'll be a mixed methods in this cycle 1. And so trying to think about just like the 1 or 2 questions that I would want to ask them at the end of this experience, and really trying to, like you said, zero in on, what is it that I really want to know? And I think I'm still sort of wrestling with that. There's a lot of things I want to know. So I think it's more the like, narrowing it down. But as I was going through, obviously all the things that you guys had struck me, but in chapter 2 of Sapsford, they really started to go into like this idea of don't just pose the obvious question, but reframe it. And like, it was like, instead of looking at why theft occurs, or it was, they said, reframe it as who does the stealing. And so I think that relates to my problem of practice, because in medicine, we've been just continuing to say, why does burnout persist? Why does burnout persist? Why does burnout persist? And then we do this wellness thing, and then we do this well-being thing, and then we do this. And I feel like this concept of flourishing that I'm introducing is kind of reframing the question, which is to say, what happens if we advocate for flourishing versus trying to reduce burnout? So it's a little bit of that flipping towards more of a growth mindset or appreciative inquiry sort of idea. So I don't know, I'm playing with that idea a little bit, but that really struck me in terms of flipping the question so that you're not just doing the same sort of research that, if you will, everyone that's gone before you has done. And then there was also really this sense of the concern for the respondents. And this has struck me both times that I've put my IRB stuff together for where I work, in that, there's the whole risk section of the IRB. And, I've been trying to think about, okay, so if I put people through a flourishing curriculum, and then they take a flourishing index that says, am I flourishing, and I answer these questions, like, what risk is there and what concern should I have? And I think depending on, who takes it, there is this idea of sort of, why am I burned out, or am I flourishing, or am I thriving? It doesn't fall just in like a professional bucket or a personal bucket, right? It starts to be the intersection of these two things. And so how, as I continue to move forward with this, do I bring the right resources and care around people in case, one of the modules that they're going through, pings something that I can't necessarily anticipate. So
can I respond to two things real quick? One, with Kamara, the idea of flourishing, I love that. And I love the way you're thinking about reframing it, because not only is it, stopping the monotony of asking the same questions over and over, Albert Einstein's insanity, right? Expecting different results, but also you're moving away from that deficit model of thinking, right?
Yeah.
Instead of it being, why is this not working? It's like, okay, let's look for solutions here and getting more creative. So, and I connect that to my POP as well, right? Instead of it just looking at these kindergartners who have behavioral issues, it's how can we support them in what creative ways and how can we respond? And I'm also using testing. I'm using the heads, toes, knees, shoulders test for students, and it measures their self-regulation. So that's already sort of valid and been used in research to take that part out of it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say was that I connected, Sandra, with what you were talking about with the bias and how it's a really good question. Like, I don't know, basically my point with the bias is everything has bias, right? We have to recognize whether it's a survey, whether it's a interview, it's always coming from our angle. And that sort of seems to be what this research is saying, is that that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just to be aware of it, right? What our angle is. But I loved your question about that, like with this, because I'm doing a semi-structured interview. Is that quantitative? Is that qualitative? It almost seems like mixed methods in and of itself, in a way.
I don't, if it's semi-structured, then I don't think then that becomes a qualitative in-person interview, because what happens is you're giving, well, maybe not. I spoke too soon. I tend to think that it's going to be labeled as qualitative, because what happens is if it's semi-structured, my assumption is that it's structured that way so that when they give you some of their open-ended responses, you go where, like, you go into level 2, level 3. So that would be more qualitative. But these quantitative in-person interviews, I think have more close-ended questions. So you're asking in person, but it's not the same thing as if you're giving them a lot of space to answer anything that they want, and then you can go follow through with like a level 2, level 3 question. So that's what
yeah, your definitions are accurate. That's what they are. But I think that when you actually do the practice, the lines get pretty blurry, right? Because the whole point of an interview is to be working in the moment with the person and like responding to what they see. So even if you're doing a quantitative, fully structured interview, you're still seeing their responses, and you may be adjusting your tone or your reaction, or even the way you're asking a question. So I think that those lines sometimes get more blurry than definitions explain. Yeah. But you're right. I'm definitely doing more qualitative because they're following my quantitative data collection, and I want to be able to say, like, okay, this is what the data shows. Well, how can I fill in these gaps?
Yeah, and I think to Kelly's point about bias, right? Kelly was starting off with she's always concerned with the bias. I mean, I feel like with, at least for my pop, when I do these, I'm already worried about the focus groups, because people have like the students, I'm already thinking about selection bias. The students that are going to be coming to these focus groups, hopefully, are students that have taken the workshop. Well, they self-selected to take that workshop for the most part. They could have just been a no-show and probably gotten stink eye from someone, but it wasn't for a grade or anything like that. So if they come, I'm really, I want to work really hard at making sure that they understand, like, there is no implications to my work. I need to know the good, the bad, the ugly. If not, we're not going to learn. But I worry that because they know me and they'll associate change making with me, and they don't want to hurt my feelings, that they're not going to be truthful. So that bias that you talk about, Kelly, is real. And then, Melissa, you and I will keep working on that. And I love what you said, Kamara, about reframing the question. And it's so true, right? Because I'm really horrible at idioms, but watch this, guys. When all you have is a hammer, when you only have a hammer, all you see are nails, right? So this idea that if all we're talking about is how to prevent burnout, then in a survey in particular, it's like we have like these microscope, like focus, like a spotlight. We're only going to spotlight on answers, and we're forgetting all the stuff that could be happening out there. So I love the idea that you might flip it, or hopefully you'll flip it, so it's much more divergent thinking, right? So it's sort of like opening up the field for possibility, as opposed to saying like zoom in on the solution. Like, we don't know what the solution is. First, you need to explore. So that's
for the kind of going back to the bias a little bit. I think that's why, like, my first point and concept that stood out was standardization, because when we're talking about quantitative surveys, and when we do standardize a quantitative survey, whether it's in person or whether it's, you know, something we disseminate through like Google Forms, if it's the same questions every single time, they're consistent, like regardless again of your sample that you ask, like it's going to be the same question. Versus I get like in the qualitative interviews how your response might change, but and you get deeper qualitative questions that way, and then you can codify that, and then that's where you can like quantify. But I think like, and as I was listening to what you all were talking about with like the focus groups, and Sandra, I want to talk to you more about focus groups like later. Like I'm really interested in your process and how that goes. And you with your experience with designing surveys, like I think that's another thing that we can all help each other, like accountability for bias, is having each other look at each other's surveys or questions, because especially since like we're in the weeds with our pop. And so if we have someone else that it's not their pop, look at them, you know, you can get a different set of eyes looking at like your questions and being like, oh, well, you're like leading them down this path, it looks like, with these questions. So that might be something we want to do. And I wanted to ask a question to Melissa about your triangulation of data, because I remember that from a couple classes back, and that's probably where I feel like weak. Like I understand that it's how you like make your case and like how it's really strong, but like what are your thoughts on that? And like if that's too much to go into, we can talk about it later, but I definitely am like very interested in like hearing more about like how you're gonna, like what your process is to like data triangulation.
Yeah, thanks for asking. First, just to say, like your whole thought of bias is spot on, because you know, with all our work in our other class right now, I'm thinking, okay, even if you create a standardized survey, there's still a bias there, right, for whoever's values and world life perspective and all of that. So the more people who look at it, the better. But yeah, in terms of triangulation, especially with the qualitative, I'm just nervous about that becoming too biased, too much of just my opinion. And so I thought it would be good to come at it from different angles. You know, my qualitative, basically my quantitative is asking, like, did the mindfulness-based intervention work? I've got their pre and their post scores of self-regulation. So was there any change there? And then all my qualitative is, how did they learn, and sort of more about their experience. And, you know, theoretically, I'm doing it from a social cognitive. So I want to know, like, if my modeling and co-regulation as teaching influenced their self-regulation scores, and if their social experience within the classroom did as well. So I feel like I'll interview them to find out that information, but then, like, depending on what pictures they draw, how they describe what impacted them, all that will sort of help to reinforce the conclusions I draw in terms of triangulation. But again, I still have no idea really what questions I'm going to ask, because that's the big part, right? How to get that data.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I actually was not keeping time. I have no idea how much time it's been.
We're just over, so we need to wrap up.
Okay,
Wrap up.
great. Sounds good. If there are no more last thoughts, then thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye.